Welcome to the Pardes channel. Today, we explain Prophets Judges chapter 17 in a clear and simple way, step by step. We're breaking down a truly fascinating and honestly bizarre piece of history today. This is a story about a deeply broken family, a massive fortune of stolen silver, and the incredibly dangerous creation of a completely homemade, do-it-yourself religion. It's a chapter that really gets into the messy reality of what happens when people completely lose their moral compass. Here is our step-by-step agenda for today. We're going to track this logically right from the beginning of the chapter to the end. We'll start with an era without kings. Then we'll look at the stolen silver, the homemade shrine, the wandering Levite, a priest for hire, and finally, the illusion of righteousness.
Section 1. An era without kings. Let's set the stage by looking at the spiritual anarchy of this specific time period.
Now, to really understand the sheer chaos of this chapter, we absolutely have to start with a crucial piece of context. It's found right there in verse 6, which tells us, "In those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit." According to this simple contextual meaning, what we call the peshat, this single verse is the lens through which we have to view this entire story. It was a time of utter moral and religious subjectivity. Think about what that actually means. There was no centralized leadership. There was no absolute authority holding things together. Because of that, the standard for right and wrong wasn't the law of God anymore. It was simply whatever a person felt like doing, whatever seemed right in their own eyes. It's the ultimate expression of making up your own rules. I want you to keep this atmosphere of absolute spiritual anarchy in mind because it explains perfectly the wild behavior of the main characters we are about to meet.
Section 2. The Stolen Silver. We're going to take a close look at a very broken family dynamic.
The narrative actually begins in the hill country of Ephraim, and we're introduced to a man named Micah. Right away, in verses 1 and 2, we are thrown into the middle of a family drama involving the theft of 1,100 shekels of silver from Micah's own mother. We need to put that number into perspective, because a shekel was a unit of weight. We are talking about roughly 28 pounds of solid silver. This isn't just a few missing coins, it's a staggering, life-changing fortune. So the mother realizes her massive treasure is completely gone, and she is furious. She utters a severe, terrifying divine curse upon the unknown thief. But here is the kicker. She has no idea that the culprit is her own son, Micah, who is likely standing right there beside her, listening to her call down this horrible curse.
You really have to look at the chaotic logic of what unfolds next. It's just wild. A son steals an absolute fortune from his mom. The mother speaks this terrible curse out loud. Well, Micah hears the curse and he gets totally spooked. He gets scared enough to confess, and he says to her, "Behold, the silver is with me, I took it." Now, you would expect some serious consequences here, right? But in a stunning twist in verse 2, instead of demanding accountability or punishing him for grand theft, the mother immediately reverses course. She actually says, "Blessed be my son of the Lord." Think about how messed up that is. She uses the holy name of God to bless a thief simply because she got her money back. There is zero moral correction happening here. It's just pure convenience.
The absurdity doesn't stop there. In verse 3, Micah physically hands the 1,100 pieces of silver back to his mother. She is so thrilled that she proudly declares she is completely dedicating this returned silver to the Lord, specifically to make a graven image and a molten image for her son. But wait, in verse 4, when it comes time to actually hand over the cash to pay for this, the mother only takes 200 pieces of silver and gives them to a silversmith to create these idols. Do the math. She claims she was dedicating all 1,100 pieces, but she very clearly kept 900 pieces of silver straight in her own pocket. This entire exchange just perfectly highlights the deep, deep hypocrisy of this family. They talk a big game about dedicating things to God, but their actions are completely self-serving.
Section 3. The Homemade Shrine. Let's look at how Micah creates a completely DIY religion.
So what happens with these newly forged silver idols? Verse 5 tells us that Micah decides to set up his own personal house of God. To make his new setup look official and legitimate, he crafts two specific things, an ephod and teraphim. Now let's stick to the Torah's simple text, the peshat, to understand what these are. An ephod is a highly sacred, specialized garment that was meant strictly and only for the high priest working at the true tabernacle. It's intensely holy. Teraphim, on the other hand, are household idols. They are literal pagan artifacts that are strictly 100% forbidden by the laws of Moses. And just to top off this entire operation, Micah simply consecrates one of his own sons to act as his personal priest. He literally just points to his kid and says, "You're the priest now."
This situation perfectly captures the deep, glaring contradiction of Micah's actions. He is actively blending the dedication of his silver to the Lord with the strictly forbidden practice of making and bowing down to idols. It's like a religious Frankenstein. He is treating the God of Israel like some local, manageable pagan deity. He builds a DIY temple right there in his backyard, throws in this confusing mix of holy garments and unholy statues, and then appoints his own kid as the ultimate religious authority. It is the absolute perfect example of what we talked about earlier. Every man doing what is right in his own eyes. There is no adherence to truth here, just a guy inventing a religion that feels comfortable to him.
But even Micah seems to realize on some level that having his own son play the role of a priest isn't quite legitimate enough. He knows it looks fake. He wants a professional to run his house of gods. Which leads us to ask a very important question. Who on earth will ultimately take over this counterfeit religious operation?
Section 4. The Wandering Levite. Enter the ultimate opportunist. Verses 7 and 8 shift our focus away from Micah's house and out onto the road. Here we meet a young man from Bethlehem in Judah. We are told he is a Levite. Now, the Levites were very special. They were the Israelite tribe specifically chosen and set apart by God to minister in the tabernacle and to teach the law to the people. They had a sacred designated purpose. But verse 8 tells us something very strange. This young Levite has left his designated home. He is just wandering around in search of a better opportunity, a place to stay. He's drifting. And as he journeys, looking for a gig, he stumbles directly into the hill country of Ephraim and walks right up to Micah's doorstep. It's a collision course of two very compromised people.
Section 5. A priest for hire. Let's look at this purely spiritual transaction.
In verse 9, Micah starts chatting with the traveler and asks him where he's from. The young man answers, "I am a Levite, looking for a place to stay." Well, Micah's eyes probably lit up. He immediately sees an incredible opportunity to upgrade his completely illegitimate shrine. In verse 10, Micah makes his pitch. He says, "Dwell with me, and be unto me a father and a priest." And for this highly esteemed, supposedly secret title, Micah offers an annual salary of exactly 10 shekels of silver. I want you to remember the math from earlier. Micah and his mother just casually handled 1,100 shekels of stolen silver, but he's only willing to pay his so-called spiritual father a measly 10 shekels a year. It shows you exactly how much he actually values this religion.
The purely transactional nature of this deal is absolutely striking. Alongside those 10 pieces of silver, Micah throws in a suit of apparel and daily victuals, basically room, board, and clothes. Verses 11 and 12 tell us the really tragic part. The Levite is perfectly content to dwell with the man on these terms. He simply agrees to the contract, he moves in, and he becomes like one of Micah's own sons. Micah formally consecrates the young man, and this Levite officially becomes the priest of this completely illegitimate, idol-filled backyard shrine. True faith and sacred duty have been entirely replaced by a cheap financial arrangement. The Levite sold out his holy calling for a change of clothes and a meal ticket.
Section 6. The Illusion of Righteousness. Let's look at the ultimate trap of self-deception.
We come to the final verse of the chapter, verse 13, and this quote highlights Micah's absolute, total self-deception. He looks at his setup and says out loud, "Now I know that the Lord will do me good, seeing I have a Levite as my priest." He genuinely, truly believes that by simply buying a real, legitimate Levite, he has somehow magically validated his entire corrupt operation. Let's recap what he actually did. He stole a fortune from his own mother. His mother used the money to make strictly forbidden carved idols. He built a fake temple to house them, and then he hired a wandering Levite who had completely abandoned his true post. Yet despite breaking almost every single rule in the book, Micah confidently thinks he has manipulated God into blessing him. He thinks the outward appearance of having a Levite covers up the massive underlying rot of his actions.
So what do we actually take away from this? The practical life lessons from this chapter are incredibly profound. First, it warns us directly against the extreme dangers of subjective morality. When we lose an objective standard, when we just do what's right in our own eyes, we end up exactly like Micah, hopelessly mixing a little bit of truth with a whole lot of forbidden, toxic practices. We also see the grave danger of treating faith, or doing the right thing, as a mere financial transaction, where we try to literally buy a clear conscience or purchase a blessing. And most importantly, we see the terrifying trap of self-deception. It is so easy to trick ourselves into believing we are acting righteously and that we deserve a blessing just because we found a clever loophole or built a comfortable setup that perfectly suits our own personal desires. We leave you with this final thought to ponder about the nature of true morality versus self-deception as we wrap up this explainer. Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.